Hi, everyone, and welcome to this latest in the UK and a Changing Europe Lunch Hour series. Today, we're talking about security, defence and foreign policy cooperation between the UK and the EU. And I'm joined with, whatever, a fantastic panel. Iain Gill heads the EU Foreign Policy, Development Policy and Institutions teams at the Foreign Office, which I think you've done since 2022. Iain, if I'm not mistaken. Nicolai von Ondarza is head of the EU Europe division at the SVP German Institute for Foreign and Security Affairs in Berlin. You should look him up online. He's written a load of really interesting things, and he's well worth following for his analysis of European politics, particularly foreign policy. And then we have our own Richard Whitman, Senior Fellow with UK and a Changing Europe, Professor at the University of Kent. And Jannike Wachowiak is a researcher here at UK in a Changing Europe, who does most of the work I take credit for on UK-EU relations. So without further ado, do as ever stick your questions in Slido and do vote for the questions you want me to put to the panel, and I will promise to do my best to get to as many as possible. But just as a starter for 10 for all of you, where are we at in foreign security and defence policy cooperation? Where have we reached in terms of that relationship now? And Iain, I'm going to kick off with you.
Thanks, Anand, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel today. I suppose the first thing I'd say is that about the security relationship with the European Union is it's very important to the UK. The integrated review refresh sets out that the Euro-Atlantic area is our core priority in terms of foreign and security policy, and that we're supportive of geopolitically active EU. We see the EU as having an important role to play alongside its member states. We were also clear in that we will cooperate with the EU on areas of shared interest and where we can. You may have heard the Foreign Secretary refer to partner, friend, neighbour. Which is how he sums up. The second thing, that the degree of contact we have at the moment is regular, and that the trajectory is going in the right direction. That hasn't been the case the entire time since we left the European Union. But looking over the last year, since the signing of the Windsor Framework, the last 2 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen increasingly regular contact between the two sides on areas of foreign security policy. The PM spoke to President von der Leyen at the weekend, you may have seen, and the Foreign Secretary had one of his calls with High Representative Borrell last week in advance of yesterday's FAC, and Mr. Mitchell and others have those relationships. All of that is underpinned by really good regular drumbeat of senior official engagement from the permanent undersecretary of the Foreign Office with his counterpart in the EEAS down, and that covers a range of areas. Of course, Ukraine has been and will continue to be a big focus, but China, the Western Balkans, what's going on in Gaza recently. We have a really good regular beat of rhythm of coordination on sanctions. Again, really taken off over the last couple of years, but in a lot of other areas as well. Alicia Herbert, who's the FCDO's gender envoy, was in Brussels a couple of weeks ago talking about the work we're doing and the EU is doing on women and girls' rights. So there's that regular drumbeat of cooperation we have. Of course, engagement and regular consultations are important, but the main thing is whether that delivers outcomes for both sides and the benefit that that's bringing. I think there as well, the relationship is in a really good place. I will talk about some of these areas in a bit more detail, I'm sure, but sanctions, as I mentioned, has been particularly positive. Working with the EU and with the US and others, there's been really close coordination, which estimates put as having denied Russia up around about 400 billion in funding that it hasn't been able to use for its war effort. The EU has seconded a liaison officer into our military training mission in the UK. That was done before they set up their own mission, and they've continued that because they really value the coordination that position enables. And again, outside of Ukraine, just to mention a couple of areas on China, there was really good discussions in advance of the recent EU-China summit with the EU side. President von der Leyen made a very important speech about, I think, May last year, and before that we were speaking to her team, and you see quite a degree of similarity between the UK and the EU approaches and what we're saying on China. Crisis cooperation. Thinking back last year, the UK supported a number of EU nationals to leave Sudan when it kicked off there, and then in Niger a few months later, a number of British nationals were supported to leave by EU individuals. So we have a lot of different examples of areas where we're working closely together. I'm very happy to expand on that as we go through the discussion and interest in the questions we get. But I'll stop there for opening remarks.
Thank you. It's a very upbeat start, if I may say so. So, Nicolai, are you every bit as positive about the state of relations as Iain is?
I would say almost. First, thank you for having me. Good to see everybody. I think from an EU perspective, you can certainly say that foreign and security cooperation with the UK is improving, but there's still much room for further improvement. And you could say the low point was probably right after the agreement on the TCA, where it was a decision from the back then Johnson government not to conclude a specific chapter on foreign and security policy cooperation, but say this is an area where there would be only ad hoc cooperation. But sort of with the twin events of both Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also the agreement on the Windsor framework, I'd say these two allowed for at least more regular ad hoc cooperation. And Iain has mentioned quite a few of that that I would say are also appreciated from a European side, specifically the cooperation on sanctions, both bilaterally, but also with the United States and the G7. You mentioned a couple of the dialogues the two sides are having, but I would say from a European perspective, there's still also much more room for improvement. So there's still the question lingering around, if we have this close cooperation, should there not be a more structured dialogue? Should there not be much more regular contacts on some of these issues which with the EU has with other partners? I would say there's still a big question mark on defense cooperation, where outside of the PESCO military mobility project, the UK has been much more cautious. It has, for instance, left all the EU operations we currently have in the Red Sea, the engagement by the US and the UK, and now a separate EU operation. The UK has left the operation in the Western Balkans. So there is, if you compare it to the pre-Brexit state, quite a few of bits and pieces where cooperation is not only much lower than it used to be, but also lower than with other partners. And so, for instance, if you might compare it these days to Norway, there is certainly closer cooperation. With Ukraine. In some areas, there's closer cooperation, so there is some leeway to go. And that being said, I would say looking ahead into the future, for me, there are two big question marks on the table. The first is which political path will the UK take? We are looking at the elections. We have seen the opposition taking a different stance than the current government. And I think from an EU perspective, after the UK made it quite clear in 2020, 2021 that it didn't want a structured cooperation, from an EU perspective, the next big move would need to come from the UK. And then the other big question mark is across the Atlantic. You mentioned initially the potential Trump election presidency. And this is really shaking up the European defense policy debate. With lots of new proposals discussed behind the scenes. And there will be really a big question, will other European states focus that on the EU? Will it focus more on NATO? How will EU and NATO align there? And what place will the UK have as still one of the primary European military powers, which the other EU Europeans will want to integrate and cooperate with? But this will certainly be a big question going forward. When and if the EU becomes even more active on security and defense, whether and where there's place to cooperate with the UK and under which circumstances the UK will want to do that.
Can I just press you a little bit, Nicolai, on? I mean, you say that compared to the situation when the UK was a member state, things are different and we're not contributing to missions in the same way and so on. I mean, let's be honest, our contributions were pretty trivial when we were a member state. Well, I mean, for very good reasons. I mean, we were engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we had other things going on. So it's not a criticism, but actually we weren't really contributing that much. So in sort of real terms, how big is that gap between being a member and not being a member? How big has it proven so far?
So I would say first, for a country like the UK, it's probably the area where it misses the EU least. Let's just be fair about it. I mean, the UK is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, leading member of NATO. It has one of the widest diplomatic networks of any European countries. So for a country of like the UK, it's not that with EU membership, everything about foreign and security policy cooperation with European countries falls away. That being said, for me, the biggest value of EU common and foreign and security policy has always been the intense coordination, these almost daily meetings in Brussels, the very close networks, the foreign ministers meeting at least once a month, all the bilaterals you can have at the margins of the council meeting, the separate meetings you have in the United Nations. And then it's these kind of coordinations where the UK is not a member of, not at the table. As far as I know, I think there's only been one participation in an EU Foreign Affairs Council since then. And I think this is the biggest loss, this constant coordination with the European partners, which doesn't necessarily always lead to a joint opinion. You just have to look at the war in Gaza for that. But at least it leads to this very, very close coordination. And the second one is about the missions. Sure, the UK hasn't been the biggest participants in EU operations, but it has played a leading role in the Balkans. So Operation Althea in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is left. It played a big role in the anti-piracy operation at the coast of Somalia. And of course, to be realistic looking forward, if we look at the picture of European defense and think about the options that we can have a US president which openly says, let Russia attack countries that don't pay their 2% of GDP. We as Europeans need to cooperate closer together. And this is where certainly Berlin and Paris will want to work with the UK as closely as possible, even if in the past it hasn't been a substantial contributor to all EU military operations.
Okay, I'm sure we're gonna come back to Trump in a little while, but Jannike, from your assessment, where are things now? Are they in a good place?
I think people on both sides are saying that the Windsor framework certainly has made a huge impact, has had a huge impact on the relationship overall. And then you've had the Russian war in Ukraine, which has led to an intensification of kind of the informal and ad hoc contacts between the two sides. But what I would point out is that the EU has not necessarily been the main venue for cooperation on Ukraine. So there has been a lot of coordination in the Quad with France, Germany, the US, and the UK, and also in the G7, particularly when it comes to coordination on sanctions. But EU-UK kind of bilateral cooperation hasn't necessarily been the main venue in that context. And if you look at the TCA, there is obviously no provision in there for political summits or a more structured dialogue. And what we've seen kind of following the Windsor framework is that some of the very limited provisions that are in the TCA, like dialogue on cybersecurity or dialogue on counterterrorism, those have now been set up. But those provisions are extremely limited. There are 5 security dialogues that are foreseen in the TCA, and then there's a broader article on global coordination and cooperation, but it's not entirely clear how that's going to be implemented. So I think what's probably lacking also compared to other relationships is the political input, because the TCA is very technical. So you have lots of committees, specialized committees and working groups under the TCA, but they don't really have high-level political input. And even though Lord Frost, the UK negotiator, said that political summits are going to happen naturally and organically, none have taken place so far. And as Nicolai has said, the UK Foreign Secretary has so far only attended one Foreign Affairs Council. So kind of that political level is still lacking compared to other third country relationships that the EU has, I would say. And then I would probably also say that Ukraine is also quite a unique case for cooperation. So cooperation has been going really well on Ukraine, but it's quite unique in the sense that it's a direct threat to European security, and the EU has been at least relatively united in terms of its response as well, which has made cooperation easier. So I think other cases might not be as clear-cut in the future. And there's, of course, a big question mark about kind of external shocks and drivers in the future, which I'm sure we're going to discuss later on. So I would say kind of overall, there's been a lot of informal and ad hoc cooperation, but it still seems to be in first gear, really, compared to kind of other political dialogues that the EU has with other third countries. And I think also in terms of what Nicolai said about where the EU is going in the future, with a view to defense industrial policy in particular, the UK is going to be shut out of a lot of those things that are kind of coming down the line. So they're kind of big question marks over that.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much. Richard.
Thanks very much, and thanks for all the others coming first and saying all the difficult things. Maybe just not to run over the same points. I mean, it's clear the diplomatic weather has improved, and I think Iain set that out very clearly. I think what we've ended up with, though, is what I call a kind of organised ad hocery. You know, we've got clearly we've got sort of regularity in the relationship. You know, there's connectivity and regular interaction at all sorts of levels. But the thing that I think is an open question for me is, you know, what's the purpose of this cooperation? You know, what's the long-term ambition for the cooperation, and really what's an appropriate comparison of the EU-UK relationship? We know very well, and this has already been touched on, that there are different kinds of ways in which the EU connects with other countries, which are organized to different degrees in terms of formal agreements and frequency of formal meetings and so on. But you know, we've, as Theresa May said, you know, when she was Prime Minister, she sought to really have a relationship that was built on two pillars, you know, which was the trade relationship and also the security relationship. We've clearly not ended up with anything that looks and feels like that. But we've ended up with something where both sides, obviously through Russia's war in Ukraine, have realized the importance of working together, have found all sorts of ways to synchronize policy. But I think Jannike's point about being in first gear is very well made. It's sort of the sense as to getting out of first gear, I think, is still very much an open question. And on the issue of defence in particular, and where the EU is going on defence and defence industrial, I think that's a far more complicated area than working together on foreign policy.
Interesting. I mean, I suppose there are two things. There's the functional thing, which is how do Europeans do security best? And there's the specifically EU thing, which might not necessarily be the answer to that first question. So, I mean, the first, I suppose, the follow-on question would be, if you were envisaging improvements to the foreign security policy relationship between the UK and the EU, what kinds of things might make the most difference? You've all talked, or most of you have talked a little bit about the absence of political context. For instance, it seems to me that on a case like Ukraine, where everyone basically agrees, that matters probably less than in a case where people are trying to coordinate opinions a little bit more. But if I were to say to you, okay, give me 2 or 3 areas where actually we might foresee closer cooperation, which would make a substantive difference, what would you say? In no particular order, and you don't all need to go, and Iain, if you don't want to give policy proposals, that's absolutely fine. Or if none of you want to speak, that'll just be embarrassing, but we'll see if I can wait you out. Go, Jannike, go on.
Well, I'm going to take the easy point, which is the political dialogue point, which we've already kind of alluded to. So I think it's interesting to look at what other models the EU has for political dialogue with third countries. And one interesting model is the strategic partnership agreement with Canada, for example, where you have quite a developed kind of set of dialogues at different levels, so at officials level, but also at political level. So you have kind of annual summits at leaders level, you have meetings between foreign ministers, You also have the Joint Ministerial Committee, which is chaired by the High Representative on the EU side and the Canadian Foreign Minister on the other side. And then you have kind of a bulk of dialogues below that. And I think kind of what that does is probably it kind of gives you a certain degree of continuity. It means you're not only talking to each other if something really urgent has come up, but also just kind of on a regular basis. You can maybe be a bit more forward-looking, do some horizon scanning and stuff like that. And it also means that you have regular political input to just drive things forward and maybe unblock things if there are any challenges. And I guess that's just what you don't have in the TCA, because it's much more kind of at the technical committee level, the relationship, even though you have the Partnership Council, which is more political, but that's only met twice so far since the TCA has come into force. So I think that would probably make a difference to the relationship. But I think feasibility very much depends on politics, because I think the current UK government has a lot of concerns when it comes to kind of putting in more structure. So I think that wouldn't be feasible under the current government.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the British government makes a lot of the fact that our new Foreign Secretary has a really, really good address book, and he knows people really well, and he's used to interacting with these people. And this makes a qualitative difference to our foreign policy, because he can pick up the phone to people he's worked with before. And it would seem on the surface, at least, that logic would push us towards having a more institutionalized relationship with the European Union, because the same would hold true. The better we know our counterparts and the more we deal with them, the easier it might be. But Nicolai, you were going to come in. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I also wanted to make the political dialogue point, but to make two more out of the field propositions. I think the first one from my side would be closer sanctions coordination. It's already an area that works quite well, but I think if we can, for instance, set up a joint unit for sanctions enforcement, more sort of speed up the work level dialogue that we currently have with more political dialogue on that, I think that could really be a valuable contribution working to the benefits on both sides. And then I would say we need to tackle what I call the Galileo problem. That is sort of working between the EU and the UK on an area where the UK obviously can bring a big benefit. It was a crucial part of the Galileo program, but where the EU only offers participation for third countries with non-decision-making rights, with limited access for industries and very stringent cooperation. And this is, for me, the biggest challenge going forward, to find a way where we all say it's a win-win area. Both sides have lots of interest in cooperation, but if you look into the detail, it's very difficult for the EU to fit in a partner like the UK, and it's very difficult for the UK to accept the conditions that the EU would set. And therefore, I would propose, let's take a very specific project, be it Galileo or maybe satellite-based internet that both the EU and the UK are working on to have a competitor to Starlink, which has also become very important for foreign and security policy. And let's work out a model where the EU shows more flexibility to accommodate a partner like the UK, but at the same time, the UK is willing and finds a condition to chip in its resources into a major EU-led project. And I think that could be, it's a bit more of a moonshot. It's far harder to work on the technicalities and the political conditions around it. But I think if we work it out on one case, we could really get a big step forward in the EU-UK relations on foreign and security policy.
I mean, you say it's a win-win, Nicolai. I suppose it's a win-win unless you have an extremely French vision of the development of the European defence industrial market, which is a very closed vision.
I say it's a win-win in the sense that when we started the Brexit negotiation, it was for a long time assumed that foreign and security affairs cooperation is like the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest bit of cooperation. It's the most intergovernmental area of the EU anyways. It's the area where the UK is sort of most sort of on the highest level amongst EU member states, where the interest on both sides to cooperate is quite clear. But then what you're saying is precisely true. We found out along the way that despite these high overlap in interest, values, and priorities, we found it harder to cooperate in that area because the EU was often close to third countries. And this is what I call the Galileo problem, where it really surfaced for the first time, and the UK was pushed out of the Galileo project. And this is why I think we need to tackle that and find a way to accommodate that. And you're right, that would also mean confronting some of the French ideas, for instance, on the joint ammunition procurement at the moment, where the French are trying to push in Brussels that this ammunition can only be bought from EU-based firms, not other NATO allies, not other countries. And this is an area where I think it's not just the UK which is closed off the cooperation, but to some extent also the EU by setting these very strict conditions.
Iain, I notice you nodding. I don't know if you want to nod out loud or...
Yeah, happy to nod out loud. I think responding to a couple of points that have come up. You said at the outset, it was a fairly positive introduction I gave. I think there is room for improvement. There are more things we could do. I think perhaps the assessment that we're in first gear is maybe just a little harsh, and I'd sort of point back to this trajectory. Where we were a year ago. So we might need to invent some half gears to describe that situation if we're in first. But I think we're a couple of gears above that. We're probably not in fifth, to extend the analogy. And on who's a suitable comparator for the UK, I think it's another question. We're no longer a member state. So in terms of monthly meetings of foreign affairs ministers and having all those bilaterals that they get every month through being in the Foreign Affairs Council and other councils, I think that isn't something we would expect to replicate as a third country. So what more could be done on your question? I think a political dialogue. This isn't something we're ideological about, and I think the mechanisms, the ways in which we do cooperation with the EU will continue to evolve and will continue to be looked at. Because as I said at the beginning, I think the main focus for us is it delivering the outcomes? Is it delivering the cooperation that we need it to deliver? Where we in the EU are we doing everything that we can together on our shared objectives? I think we have shown, I genuinely believe, over the last couple of years that we can cooperate closely without that sort of formal dialogue. I pose the question, I would say we are doing probably more close cooperation than the likes of Japan or Canada are with the EU, despite the fact they have those political dialogues that happen regularly. Taking sanctions as an example, I think so. Just is it last week? It was earlier this month. We had our most recent sort of quarterly stocktake. Load of UK officials went out to Brussels, met with their counterparts in DG FISMA and in the EEAS to discuss what we're doing in sanctions. That's in addition to very, very regular conversations we're having on all sorts of things, from design of sanctions, implementation, to circumvention, and to enforcement. We've gone on joint visits with the EU and with the US. We do a lot of this with the US as well, bilaterally or trilaterally, to third countries to look at circumvention. I think that's had some results. And the bilateral work does complement what we do in those larger forums. It's something like sanctions. There has to be a large G7 element to that. There is, I'm just going to check my notes, there is the Sanctions Coordinators Forum, which again met last week, hosted by David O'Sullivan in Brussels. And I think he highlighted the very close preparation that had been done with the UK in preparing for that. I think these ways of working have enabled us to be very agile, to move quite fast. And there are some areas on sanctions where it is easier for the UK to move quickly than it has been for the EU or for the US, and these relationships have enabled us to all do that at different paces. In terms of sort of areas where we could do more, of course, it's the right question. I think PESCO is one that we have outlined as expect everybody on the panel is aware. Hopefully, our audience is as well. We have applied to join the PESCO military mobility project. That is still under negotiation to finalise, but something we remain committed to doing. The different dialogues under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So 2 of those, cyber and counterterrorism, have both now had their first meetings. They were agreed at the Partnership Council last year after the Windsor Framework was signed. So there are a few more referenced in the TCA that we can definitely look to set up. A side point, they have taken a while. They have taken a while to get going. And I do think it's worth bearing in mind that the process of setting up something that is structured, that has minutes and agendas and statements, and the consultation that happens on both sides, particularly the EU side before that, does often mean these things can take quite a while. And I think in terms of our cooperation with the EU, we do always want to bear in mind that balance between getting things done and where more formal structures will come in. But we will consider those and pursue those where necessary, as we've done on those dialogues, as we've done on PESCO. And defence industry. It's been mentioned a few times. We may come back to this in more detail.
We'll come back to this, Iain. It was Jannike, what you need to learn is that the Rolls-Royce Civil Service has a 10-speed gearbox. So there are lots and lots of gears. So we're probably in about 4th, not 1st. But Richard, you wanted to come in on third countries? Yeah,
I mean, I don't think we should let the EU off the hook on this, because I mean the strategic compass, which is the EU's sort of roadmap for greater global influence. I mean, it did suggest it was going to take a long, hard look at the relationship with third countries and maybe look at ways in which they could connect more effectively. And I think that's I think we're still in the waiting room on that. And if you look at the sort of the way that the EU has responded to Ukraine, I mean, it has operated a pretty closed system when it comes to the military equipment support for Ukraine, which is perfectly understandable in terms of the member states sort of feeling their way forward and doing something that they haven't done previously. But I don't think it's necessarily been the best way to sort of build out and to build partnerships. And bearing in mind that we're going to be dealing with the issue of Ukraine for probably as long as we can all foresee. So it's something that the EU has probably still got a job of work to do. We'll have to wait and see, obviously, what the incoming Commission might want to do in terms of its priorities. And it's already been flagged that von der Leyen likes the idea of having a commissioner for defence. And where that extends will be interesting to see, because obviously defence industry is one thing obvious, but what's the ambition going to be beyond that?
Jannike, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to pick up something that Richard said at the beginning about kind of the EU's relationship with third countries. And Nicolai also mentioned that earlier, that there's a bit of a paradox, really, in the way that the UK is an extremely important security actor in Europe with significant capabilities and expertise. But it's difficult for the EU to find a way or define a relationship in this area that acknowledges kind of the UK's specialness in this area almost. And I think the reason for that is that it is in the EU's DNA to differentiate between members and non-members. And I think, if anything, this kind of dynamic has been strengthened by Brexit and the experience of the Brexit negotiations. And that obviously has an impact, particularly on kind of defense industrial strategy, where the Commission is becoming a more important actor, and where they're setting up new financial instruments that are financed by the EU budget. And then very much kind of that dynamic comes in where, EU money can only go to EU companies. So I think it's just kind of this dynamic, and it is a strategic choice on part of the EU to make that distinction between members and non-members, and that non-members can't have the same access or influence. And I think it's quite unlikely that this is going to change anytime soon. There's a bit of a question mark around what the impact of a Trump presidency is going to be, if there is one.
Okay, you need to all stop answering questions I haven't asked yet. You're ruining my plans for this. I'm going to cut you off there, partly because we've had a question saying, what's PESCO? And I understand there's an awful lot of acronyms and stuff floating around. And PESCO is a scheme that basically allows subgroups of member states to do things in the area of security together, so they can break off into chunks, if you like, and decide to work on projects together. But do flag up if we're using too many acronyms and the like. Jannike, I will come back to all your points, but you really were preempting so many of the questions that we'll try and go through them. I mean, there's a question from Mike Galsworthy about the barriers to UK-EU security and defence, and I think we've touched on the fact that it's partly EU rules, it's partly UK politics, so we'll come back to both of those. But just one thing I wanted to pick up on that Iain mentioned. Now, Iain, you'd have to make the case if you don't want to, but just we quite often hear this word agile used, that, not having the overlay of formal security cooperation makes the UK agile. And I must confess that that argument's always made me wonder a bit, because it's not as if when we were a member state, we were ever stopped from doing what we wanted to do. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Iraq, and everyone seemed to have the perfect liberty to go in any which way they wanted over Iraq, EU or no EU. So where does this agility come from? And is it really true that by not having a security relationship, we have greater agility than we'd otherwise have to do what we want to do? As I said, Iain, I don't want to put you on the spot, so we can leave that to the others if you want. Go on, Nicolai.
Let please, others do. Really interested in the thoughts of the panel on this, but coming in, I don't think they are. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. No. And I think you can have, even if you have where you have a very structured top level of cooperation, there is of course all the opportunity underneath that to have the close working relationships that you need to have. I think if we think about where we are and where we've been, I think when we consider what we're looking to achieve across different theatres in the world or different issues, and we haven't talked so much about some of the softer areas of foreign policy like women and girls and development and climate change and other areas. But when we think about how to achieve them and what we're trying to deliver and where we're trying to cooperate with the EU, the focus on the ways of working that enable us to move quickly, I think, has given a good return on investment. And I think it's a case of, and I'm sure we do keep this under review. There'll be elections, not just in the UK, but in the EU, obviously. I'm sure these questions will continue to be asked in the coming years. What's to what extent would a more structured dialogue or relationship enable that delivery of the things that we're trying to do that we haven't been able to do at this moment? And as I say, I think at this moment, that trajectory of what we've been able to do together, there's a lot of examples we can point to, has been very positive.
Excellent. Nicolai, did you want to come in quickly? And then I'm going to move on to the European Defence Fund and what Jannike was talking about a minute ago.
Or you can switch directly to the Defence Fund if you want to jump in there.
Okay, I mean, it does strike me, and it's come out of this, that one of the constraints, it's too easy to think constraints on UK-EU cooperation come from the British being pig-headed and British politics. But actually, I think, you're quite right. From Galileo onwards, a certain view of the EU defence market, which became an increasingly insular view, has prevented the UK working together with the EU as closely as it might. And there are several questions here, and you pick any of them, whoever wants to. I mean, the first is, can we be extremely bitter economic rivals and very close political allies? Because that seems to be where we are now. We're going to compete on the economics, but work together very, very closely on the politics. Does that work in defence? The second thing, I mean, someone mentioned the idea being floated for a commissioner for defence policy. I mean, as a Brit, my first reaction when I saw that story was, oh, bloody hell, the more the Commission gets involved in defence, the harder it gets for the UK to work with the EU, because you're suddenly in the realm of single market rules and exclusions, and the EU and some member states more than others, I won't mention them again, being keen to exclude third countries. So I mean, firstly, do you think that's a fair assessment, that actually the EU has defined this thing in a very, very restrictive way? And secondly, is there any hope of it changing in the foreseeable future? any of you, if you could make sense of what I just said. Go on, Nicolai.
Okay, so I'll try this one. So first, I would agree with you. It's not just a UK side problem. It's hard for the EU to work with third countries, especially where it touches single market areas. But even in areas like the EDF, the European Defence Fund, where it is not connected to the single market, but where the EU says to a country like Norway, you can chip in your money, but you can't really decide where the money is being spent, and you have limited access for your industry. And that kind of works for a country like Norway that might be rich, but is still about 1% of EU GDP. So if it chips in, it's just a minor aspect of the fund. If the UK would participate according to its GDP, it would be north of 10% of the fund. And it's hard to imagine for the EU to accept a non-member country sitting there with full voting rights, but it's equally hard to accept for a country that chips in 10% or 12% of the money to just accept that it doesn't have a decision-making power over how that money is being spent. So I think that really is a problem. But I think we are at a turning point, or not to misuse that word, on a Zeitenwende, if the thinking about European defense is going, at least in EU quarters. I think the prospect of a second Trump presidency, but even regardless of that, the difficulties in the US Congress to mobilize further fund for Ukraine have really shaken up the thinking. And I think we're just at the start of a new wave of new thinking about how to mobilize joint funding, how to do joint procurement, how to lift some of the restriction to concentrate European defense industry. And a lot of that work will be done in the next legislative cycle of the EU. Richard has mentioned the idea of a defense commissioner. There's the idea of a special defense council of defense ministers. There's the idea of some kind of joint bonds from the EU side, like the COVID recovery fund that could be used to mobilize money for defense. And this will really make a shift of gears, not to overstretch the analogy, in the EU defense side. And I hope, or at least I think there should need to be also some rethinking in parallel how the UK could come in there, both from the UK side, whether it wants to, but also I think from the European side, which during Brexit and everything that came afterwards, you all remember the stares of Michel Barnier was very strict always to treat the UK like any other third country. And if I may say so, sort of looking from Berlin, I would argue that in defense, the UK is in a different league. And the joint interest for cooperation should be stronger, that I would at least argue for the EU to also think about more flexibilities, which I think can be defended in that special area of security and defense, precisely because it's so disconnected of the single market. And it's different from all the other discussion about access to the single market, to customs union. And one last comment on that. I think the most dangerous place could come if a future UK government would give in to the temptation of trying to trade access in security and defense with access to the single market. I think the best we have to do is sort of keep these discussions completely separate in a legal, political, and every way we can, in order not to turn this into another Brexit debate about single market, Norway model, and so on, and find a sort of flexible model for security and defense.
We'll trade you BAE systems for student mobility, Nicolai. How's that? Anyway, Jannike, I cut you off before and you were talking about this issue of the European Defence Fund and so on. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I'm maybe a little bit more pessimistic than Nicolai, because I do agree that obviously there's a lot is going to happen on the EU side in this area, and there are lots of proposals being floated at the moment, from defence bonds to a defence commissioner, and the EU is also going to publish its defence industrial strategy in a few weeks' time. So there's kind of a lot happening in that area at the moment. But I'm just not sure that, I think at the moment the focus is just on kind of fostering the EU's capabilities. And this is to an extent at the expense of relationships with important security players like the UK. And even though there might be member states who would like a closer relationship with the UK, I'm just not convinced that they're going to spend political capital on that in the EU context, where there's kind of lots of different things going on at the moment and lots of really difficult issues that the EU is going to approach in the next legislative cycle, and not just defense, but also enlargement and migration and all of these things. So I'm just not so convinced that member states that want a close relationship are actually going to kind of use their political capital for creating more flexible arrangements for the UK.
Okay, but are you convinced, or any of you convinced, that actually all these words from the EU mean anything? I mean, I remember the Helsinki headline goals from over 10 years ago, which were great. Everyone got very excited. There were loads of articles about how the EU had got serious on defence, and none of them were achieved, as far as I remember. I mean, do we really think... I mean, there's a lot of talk about how this is a turning point. There's been lots of new structures put in place, maybe, but are you all confident that this actually means... I mean, the European Defence Fund is still quite small in terms of needs. Do you think this really is a turning point in the history of the EU's relationship with defence? You'd better not answer this, Iain.
If I may, I mean, I think we need to step back and think about what the major security and defence problem is. It's how do we secure and ensure that Ukraine has a place in Europe where it is safe and secure, and we support Ukraine and ourselves in terms of the best setup in terms of security and defence. And for that, the EU can be a contributor, but it can't be a first order actor. And the way in which the EU makes or can make a significant contribution is obviously in the defence industrial sphere, and possibly and one might say likely provide financial resources to make that possible. But I mean, we shouldn't get too tied up with the question of a sort of institutional theology or load too much up on the EU creating a lot more acronyms and ways of thinking about security and defence, because as we're seeing on the part of individual EU member states, they're making security guarantees to Ukraine through the process that's been kicked off by the G7. They're obviously providing equipment bilaterally, as well as the stuff that's coming through the EU. So a lot of the action is actually elsewhere. And I guess one question would be, does the EU get in the way or potentially get in the way of European security, or does it enhance it? And is there a conflict between the sort of strategic autonomy agenda and providing the very best in terms of security and defence for Europe?
Nicolai.
I think first, I'd argue that the urgency is different. When we were talking about the Helsinki headline goals, we were basically talking about wars of choice. Somewhere crisis management operations, maybe at the periphery of Europe and somewhere in Afghanistan, but nothing like the situation where we have today, where EU member countries and NATO countries feel territorial and physically threatened in their existence. Just a couple of weeks ago, I spoke to colleagues from the Baltics who know family who already have precise plans on how they would pack if Russia invades. This is a very different situation to if you're talking about the crisis management operations of the 1990s and 2000s.
Yeah.
And this is really a new urgency in the EU. Secondly, I would agree with Richard that the best that the EU can contribute there is play to its strengths. So it's not sort of creating a rivalry to NATO, but precisely focusing on that defense industrial base, increasing European capabilities that can be used for territorial defense in a NATO or in a different context, but nothing that would set up rival structures to NATO, which would offend precisely those members who are now investing the most in security and defense, if you think about Poland and a lot of the increases in Northern and Central and Eastern Europe. And so maybe it's my sort of internal optimist. I'm a little bit more optimistic about this new phase, but I would caution that I expect the EU not to do everything, but really focus on this defense industrial procurement, building up capabilities rather than structures for territorial defense. And this is where I see the discussion in Brussels and at least in Berlin heading, rather than another bound of strategic autonomy versus strategic sovereignty versus capacity to act discussion that only circles around these sort of buzzwords rather than concrete capabilities.
Iain.
Thank you, Anand. Really interesting to listen to the panel, and I will accept your invitation not to comment on what exactly we expect from the EU in this area. But I just did want to add, we are really encouraged by the fact that the EU and other European countries and member states are taking steps to strengthen their industrial capacity, defence industrial capacity. The UK is absolutely looking to do the same because, as Richard says, the challenge is there and it's immediate and it's unlikely to go away in terms of how to keep on funding and supplying Ukraine. So I guess almost irrespective of, I don't know if you're going to ask this question, but what might happen in North America, that is a shared challenge for Europe, for the UK and the EU and other European countries. Nicolai has made exactly the points I would have made on NATO, that what is done needs to be joined up to an extent and complementary with that. And so I would just finish by saying, without saying exactly where industrial capacity discussions between the UK and the EU might go, it will be a part of the relationship in the years to come. Absolutely, it's going to be one of the most important things that we look at together.
But let me challenge you all on this, because the next question was about Trump, and we're talking about the next phase and getting ready. I mean, it's not utterly out of the question that by this time next year we don't have a functioning NATO with an Article 5 guarantee from the United States. Okay, and the EU taking measures now means it will have capabilities in place for a Trump presidency in 10 years' time, because defense take. So we're kind of kidding ourselves a bit when we talk about how how Trump is going to have a massive and game-changing impact, because we've kind of left it too late, haven't we? I mean, you know, if he really does come in and call into question Article 5, then the simple truth is, whatever Europe or the UK does when it comes to the defense industrial base, we're going to be very, very vulnerable for a considerable amount of time, aren't we? Or am I just very, very negative? Be cheerful, Nicolai.
I think there's no sugarcoating way around this. I mean, we suddenly, just speaking, coming from Berlin, have in Germany a discussion about a nuclear deterrent. This coming for a country that just got rid of nuclear power in electricity market, and is suddenly discussing about a European nuclear deterrent, a German nuclear deterrent, cooperation with the French or even the Brits on the nuclear deterrent. And I think there's no sugarcoating way around this, that the dependency on the Americans in security defense is strong, and that if there was a sudden cut off, that would leave Europe exposed. But this doesn't change, I think, the fact that coming forward, there needs to be a massive investment from a European side to be able to take care of its own security, but that will not happen overnight. I think the mistake that we shouldn't repeat is the one that happens after 2016, when people said, okay, we need to discuss a little bit more about strategic sovereignty. And you might remember Merkel saying we cannot trust our allies as we used to. And then very little happened in defense spending. And after Biden was elected, everybody had a sigh of relief and stopped any further, or at least didn't further pursue these kind of investments. And I think this is a change that we need, rather than tricking ourselves that we could immediately take over the American commitments, which I don't think we as Europeans collectively will be able to do either for Ukraine or in a NATO context.
Interesting. Jannike or Richard, does one of you want to come in on this question of what difference Trump might make and to what extent? I mean, will you change its rules to make cooperation with the UK more easy in the event of a Trump presidency?
I mean, just very briefly, I mean, I agree with Nicolai that the challenges are enormous, and there's going to be, I mean, there already are huge pressures on European countries to spend more on defense, and obviously a lot of them have increased their defense spending over the last few years. But all of that is also happening in a very challenging economic environment. So I think there are going to be quite difficult political trade-offs down the line. And that's also a question in terms of elections, because foreign and defense are not always kind of priorities for voters. So there's also kind of a difficult challenge there in terms of explaining to the populations these trade-offs that need to be made. And even then, just spending more money is not going to be enough. It's there also European armies are struggling to recruit the right number of people. There are kind of logistics and intelligence challenges, like if the UK were to actually pull out of European security. So I think the challenges are enormous. So there are lots of functional drivers which kind of should encourage Europeans to pool their resources and to avoid duplication and to save money, given all these kind of fiscal pressures as well. But if you look at where the EU is going at the moment, it looks more as if the focus is going to be on member states. So there is a question mark for me whether a Trump presidency is actually going to be enough to kind of lead to structural changes in how they approach that. And I guess it depends also on what kind of Trump presidency we are going to see. Is he actually going to completely pull out of NATO, or is it going to be a bit more nuanced than that? So I guess it depends on that as well. I think you're muted, Anand.
Sorry, just in the last 5 minutes, I wanted to come to the other side of the constraint ledger, which is the constraint of British politics. And here, Iain, you're off the hook completely. But we're looking ahead to the next election. Most people seem to think that Labour will win the next election. First question, and anyone can take this, will Labour bring a wholly new approach? And if so, how? Second question, will the EU necessarily be more receptive than they have been now because of a change of government?
Maybe to take the first part, and I'll leave others to take the second. I mean, what's striking when you look at what Labour is saying about foreign security and defence policy as against the government is their positions are broadly the same, with the exception of the EU. And obviously, I'll leave the trade issues to one side because there are others on this call who are more expert than me. But I think, the fact that they've come out with this idea of a security pact as a kind of eye-catching idea is interesting, that there is this sort of attempt to push the idea that the EU is the UK's most important foreign policy partner, for example, by certainly the shadow foreign secretary. So, Labour's sending all the signals that it wants to do something closer with the EU. The difficult thing, of course, is how quickly might you do that? And what does that deal look and feel like? Because obviously the more ambitious a deal, the more binding it might be, the more it might include, the more complicated and probably the longer it would take to negotiate with the EU. So that's definitely a complicating factor. And I'll hand over to others to say, whether there is a sort of receptivity or a willingness to sort of grab a Labour Party's enthusiasm with both hands.
Is there, though, Nicolai?
So to play the optimist on this panel, I think if we of course don't know yet when the UK elections will actually happen. I think the signs are now more pointing towards autumn rather than the first half of the year. But there is a scenario where the UK and the US elections could be quite close together. Mm-hmm. And so the momentum for whatever comes out of the US elections and potential change of government in the UK and the new commission leadership in the EU taking place would all happen basically roughly at the same time. And I think that does propose a window of opportunity to sort of move away from the Brexit mindset of the last years and rather to a little bit of a more constructive sort of framework. That being said, I do not think that the EU would treat a Labour government fundamentally different than a Conservative government. At least this Conservative government. There's certainly no more the distrust that there was in the pre-Windsor area on Northern Ireland and some of the, let's say, negotiation tactics employed by the UK on that. So I think from the outset, there would be a better dose of goodwill and political music. But on the crunch points on single market access, customs union, but also on the question of how to integrate a third country or cooperate with a third country in foreign and security and defense, I do not think there would be a fundamentally different policy approach from the EU side. And therefore, I think it would be wise to approach this with a little bit of caution. The window of opportunity from my perspective is certainly there, but that doesn't mean that the EU side will treat a Labour-led government completely different and let go of all of its red lines. It might even be a little bit more like the post-Windsor negotiation dynamic we have seen on Northern Ireland, where there's more willingness to talk behind closed doors, work out a compromise, and then come out with that to the public. Rather than the sort of big public style confrontation, but not necessarily much more room for going over EU red lines than there is currently with this Conservative government.
Interesting. The other interesting thing that we've now run out of time to talk about is how much time and effort Labour have invested in their relationship with Scholz and the SPD, which seems to be very, very close. And I do wonder, well, A, whether they back the right horse, and B, whether that would make any difference if they came into power. But Richard has suggested a very good little game to close with. Prime Minister Starmer comes in. Is his first trip to Washington or to an EU capital? What do you think? Iain, you're again off the hook. It's a two-horse race. It can't be that hard.
I'd say to an EU capital, because there is probably going to be an election in the US around the same time. So,
okay, Richard.
I think if we take Labour at its word, Berlin.
Interestingly, I would have said Paris. So we'll see.
Well, I'll tell you what, just to make sure someone's right, I'm going to say Washington. So there we go. Listen, thank you to all of you. Particular thanks to you, Iain. I mean, it's not always easiest as a civil servant to come onto these things, but you were fantastic. Thank you for being willing to do it. And particularly to you as well, Nicolai. Always lovely to see you and to hear your insights. I've completely forgotten to see what we've got coming next. I'm sure we've got stuff coming next that I've forgotten about, but look out on our website. Do sign up to our newsletter. We've got an awful lot of reports, including, crucially, a report on the future of UK-EU security cooperation coming out over the next few weeks. So look out for all of those, and we very, very much hope to see you soon. Thank you to all of you, and thank you for joining. All the best.